of John's work on my behalf and on your behalf for the last couple of weeks. He did a great job. Such a blessing for us to have him with us. I'm the evangelist here. I'm also a part-time exterminator. Once in a while, a spider shows up that needs to bite the dust. Not good at it, because I missed him, I guess, the first time. But we're glad that you're with us. We're glad that all those who are streaming with us. We're continuing our monthly study of the life of Jesus as it's recorded in the Gospel of Mark. We skipped last month because of other things, but we are in the last week of Jesus' life, and I believe that we're still here on Tuesday in our text. And these are the final words of Jesus in the temple. He's already done with the leadership, as Randy pointed out a little bit earlier, and now they have left for the most part, and so he's addressing the crowd. And he's going to finish with that message, and then he's going to move over by the treasury and speak to the disciples there in the latter part of this text. And it's in this section that we have the story of the widow and her mites. And I've got some mites. Tristan and Sam, you want to come forward here? I've got some highly trained helpers. And they're going to give some of these every once in a while. I've got it marked for them. So there's 5. Hold your hand out like this so I don't drop them. And look for the piece of tape. There, you can start over here, Sam. And they're just going to pass them through. When you get to the end, hold on to them. I'd really like to have them back. I guess if you don't want to give them back and you end up with 2, put them in the contribution plate next week. And then I'll get them back that way. Jesus has 2 different audiences here in our text, and consequently 2 different messages. And so let me kind of set the scene for you here. Listen, most rabbis had a habit of walking as they taught, especially in the temple area. And that first song that you led this morning, "Oh God, you are my God," and step by step you'll lead me. And you think you're walking with Jesus, and step by step he is teaching you. There were times when he stopped. Obviously, he stopped on this day and this occasion to interact with the leadership in that debate that happened. And so now they have left, but the crowds have remained. I think the fact that Jesus, when he cleared the temple the day before, the crowds loved that. They knew that the leadership was corrupt. They knew that they were paying 10 times the market price for a sacrificial animal. They knew that when they brought their coin, which had probably an image on it, that they could not put that in the treasury, and so they had money changers that would be happy to take your coin and give you a temple coin like this that didn't have an image on it, so you could put it in. But again, you're going to pay a big fee for that in doing that. So they knew that they were being cheated. And so if you look at the previous verse of our text here, at the very end, in chapter 12 and verse 37, it said that the large crowd listened to him with delight. With delight. That's hadios. Sweetly, gladly, with pleasure. And so Jesus is now going to take advantage of that characterization that they have of him and the love that they have for him to do some teaching. And while we're going to mostly be in this text, and I would have read it, but Randy already read it for us, so we're just going to go forward. I'll be going through it pretty much verse by verse in just a few minutes. So the first message here, and the first audience, is, as we said, to the crowd. That's in verses 38 through 40. And his message here is a warning to the crowds about their religious leaders. And he's now going to further expose them for what they are. And again, that started out yesterday when he cleansed the temple, and he said that you've made the temple a den of thieves. And the crowds felt helpless about that. They by tradition and because of the servitude that they were under to them, they had an obligation, a cultural and social obligation to kowtow to these people. And here at last, in Jesus, was a person who would defy them, who would expose them. And so this is Jesus' final words to these crowds. And what he's going to tell them is that he has zero tolerance for the level of failure that these leaders, these shepherds, these scribes, these teachers of the law had reached. So he's going to tell them, beware of the scribes, beware of the teachers of the law, because what they're teaching is not God's word. If you go back to the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And he gave them a correct interpretation of God's word. And these folks here, these guys here, were leading them to a place they didn't want to go. And the scribes had a saying that they liked to say and to repeat that kind of would help elevate them in the eyes of the people. They would say that God gave the law to Moses, and Moses gave the law to Joshua. And Joshua received the law, and he gave it to the elders. And the elders received the law, and they gave it to the prophets. And the prophets received the law, and they gave it to the scribes. And so in essence saying, we are the last. We're the last group, the last caretakers of the law. And they were the self-proclaimed gatekeepers and possessors of the law. They were the experts in the law. They were the lawyers. And they were the lawyers with regard to the law, both in matters religious and in matters civil. They were the arbiters. They were the ones who determined what the application and interpretation of the law was. And they wanted to be viewed that way. They wanted to be viewed as the protectors of the law. And now Jesus is saying, beware of these men, these teachers. Listen, when you can't trust the people who are over you, when you can't trust those who are supposed to know what is right and wrong, and when you can't trust them to show you what God wants, you are in big trouble. Jesus said earlier that they were sons of hell, and every proselyte that they made two times the son of hell. And that's in Matthew the 25th chapter. There it is. Woe to you, teachers of law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. And he characterizes them for us. He kind of gives us a good picture of what they were. First of all, he said they had flowing robes, which meant that their robes were long, but they had these tassels that went all the way to the ground to show off their holiness, to show off their piety. And it was fancy, and it was expensive, and it was meant to convey to others their own glory. I remember when Robin and Megan and I went to Germany, and we saw so many churches over there, and listen, those churches were gilded, and they were huge, and they were almost gaudy, but there was a purpose behind that, because when the simple people came in from the country and they saw that, they said, wow, God must be here. And that's what these people were. When the simple folks came in for the feast and stuff, and they saw these men in these long flowing robes, and when they saw that, they would assume you've got to be holy, you got to be God's man. Secondly, they loved to be greeted and to be receiving greetings in the marketplace. They moved about in public places in their fancy clerical robes. People still kind of wear those, don't they? They'll put on those garments that will set them apart from everyone else. Funny little collars or big flowing robes, and so you can identify who they are. Listen, that sets aside the very basic principle that Jesus laid down and the apostles laid down, is that you and I are equal. We are one. And we are servants, all of us. And they expected to be addressed in the marketplace with greetings and with titles of dignity and honor. In Matthew, the 23rd chapter, which is a parallel to what Mark wrote here, in verse 8 he said, "But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher and you are all brothers." They love to be called rabbi, which is another way of saying my master, my teacher. Would be equivalent to us of someone requiring you to call them doctor religiously. You read phrases in Jewish literature of these. This is one quote written to a scribe: "O great one, O knowledgeable one, O excellent one, O exalted teacher." You guys need to memorize that so you can greet me at the door with that. Listen, they viewed ignoring a scribe as being worse than ignoring the scriptures. He says on in Matthew, the 23rd chapter, and at verse 9, "Do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven." And when you talk about Father, you're talking about, you're my source, you're my ancestor, you're the one that I look to for everything that I have spiritually. And then he goes on in verse 10, "Nor are you to be called instructors or teacher, for you have one instructor, the Messiah." The Greek word is kathegetes, which means leader or guide. Have you ever heard anybody taking titles like that in the religious world? Dr. So-and-so? Now, I'm not talking about going to see Mike in his office and calling him Dr. McCowan, because that's talking about his job and his education. I'm talking about referring to someone religiously as being doctor, and then requiring it of you. Or Father, what's his name? And putting that in front of their name. Or titles like lead pastor. The one that I can't understand is somebody taking the word reverend. And for some, that's not us. I'm most reverend. You have all these other reverends out there. I'm most reverend. There's a lack of humility in that. And there's a lack of well, it's separating that person from everybody else who apparently aren't reverend. Listen, I do my best to run from titles. I do funerals and people say, okay, what do we write down? What do we write down as far as who's doing it, or how do I introduce you? I said, Dan. Just Dan. They also wanted the important seats in the synagogue. They wanted to be at the best table, the head table at banquets. And Jesus had witnessed this in Luke the 14th chapter, right before he teaches a whole parable on this. He said when he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. Jesus said, don't pick the higher places lest somebody come along and say, I'm sorry, this place is taken. You need to take a lower seat. Let me tell you what this all boils down to here. Let me go back. I don't want to take that up there. The false religion of Judaism had become, because it was created out of the hearts of men, maybe it was based on what Moses had originally given, but it wasn't related to that really anymore. It was unable to restrain the flesh. It was unable to restrain the pride and the self-promotion that you see here among the scribes. And Jesus is calling them on that. And he's also calling anybody else who follows their example to elevate themselves above others. He continues on in verse 40 and says, and remember he's addressing the crowd here, he says, they devour widows' houses. You know, when we read that, and when Randy read it earlier, it's really easy for us just to read right over that. I want you to stop right there and think about that. Picture that. Picture someone devouring a widow's house. And then I want you to follow that picture with being disgusted. These were to be the protectors. These were to be the shepherds of God's flock. And if anyone in this day and age, and there or here now included, if there's anyone who needs protection, it's widows. Widows found 68 times in the Old Testament, and most of those are instructions to care for them and to provide for them and to protect them. And these guys here are consuming them, taking away their livelihoods. A widow, when she died, maybe her husband left her an estate or some lands, and so she calls on a scribe, a lawyer, to come and help her with that, and he'd end up owning the estate. He'd mismanage her property. He would abuse her hospitality, and in every way you can imagine, they took it. Listen, the whole system was based on you bringing your money into the temple. And in the court of women, they had 13 of these wooden boxes with trumpet-style funnel-like things for you to put money in. And because it's a court of women, any Jew could get in there. There was no restrictions for Jews to be in there. And each box had a different purpose. One box would be perhaps for the wood, for the sacrifices. One would be to purchase the incense or oil. Maybe one would be to purchase the sacrifices themselves. Anyway, there were 13 of them, so you could kind of earmark where you wanted your money to go by going to those. But listen, all that money went into the pockets of the Sanhedrin, into the priesthood, which is why Jesus called them a den of thieves, because they're abusing that. I'll have more of this picture in just a moment. I just wanted you to see the funnel-like boxes. He also says that they offered long prayers. And my translation says, and for a show, they make lengthy prayers. They're making lengthy prayers not to talk to God, but for a show. Listen, if you want to say a long prayer, if you want to pray all day and pray to God, go to it. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're doing it to make a show, to appear holy and pious and spiritual, and consequently to get the praise of men, then Jesus is going to say you have your reward. Because they weren't holy men or righteous leaders, Jesus said at the end of that verse, such men will be punished most severely. Most severely. What are you supposed to be worthy of, a son of hell? Or someone who makes someone else 2 times a son of hell? And just because you're religious, and they were religious, and just because you can fool others, and they fooled others, you need to realize that, as Galatians, the 6th chapter and verse 7, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. If you want the full picture on Jesus' discussion here with the crowds, then take the time today or this week to read Matthew, the 23rd chapter. Jesus uses one word over and over again in Matthew 23, and it's woe. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. I read one just a moment ago. And the Greek word is up there on the screen for you, O-U-A-I. It's onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is a word that sounds like what it is. Like splash. Sounds like what, or plop. Sounds like when I throw a rock into the water, or something that's hard, or something that's soft. I had another one that's even better I thought of this week, and of course my mind is a sieve and it went right out. But let me pronounce this word for you. Uai. Did you hear that? Now I want you all to say it. You don't have to say it as loud as I did. Uai. That's what a person says when they've been denounced. When they've been condemned as a final statement. Uai. We would say, oh no. Utter denunciation is what Jesus gives to the scribes, the Pharisees, and the hypocrites. And listen, if they didn't hate him before, they didn't want him dead at this moment, when they heard Jesus say this, or heard about Jesus saying that, I have no doubt that they did, that would seal the deal. And please understand, Jesus is not egging them on. They're not here. As far as you know, he's talking to the crowds. He's trying to address the crowds so they can know they don't have to follow these guys anymore. He's simply speaking the truth about them to these sheep who are blindly following them to help them. And as we'll see in the next chapter, when we get into chapter 13, it's only going to be a single generation, 40 years. And this place, this temple, this whole system, the governing body of the Sanhedrin, the priesthood, the high priest, it's all going to be gone. Never to exist again. And I'll tell you that none of the crowd that's here could imagine that. None of the leadership could imagine that. But it's going to happen in 40 years. And it's at that point that Jesus walks away from the crowd. And he's been, as I said, teaching them. The illustration I had in my mind when I say that the rabbi teaches as he walks is the manta ray on Finding Nemo. And all of these little fish and crabs and stuff are on him, and he's teaching. By the way, his name is Mr. Ray. I found out. I did not know that. And so Jesus is teaching as he's walking. Now he's walking away from the crowd, and now he's going to sit down. And when you sit down, now you're going to do some formal teaching, and it's for his disciples. And so that brings us to the second message and the second audience, which is his disciples. And so he's watching the crowd there. He's sitting down. As you look at verse 41, Jesus sat down opposite the place of where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting in their money into the temple treasury. And so we have kind of an abrupt scene change. And he's watching the rich people as they are putting their money into the treasury. Now, this is a screenshot from a video that I found that was a reenactment of it. And so you have this old woman who just comes up, and she had 2 of those little coins that you just had in your hand. They're worth about 1/64th of a cent. 6 minutes of work is what that's worth. Now, in the video, the guy on the left and the guy on the right, they've got bags of money. And you can't just take your bag and just turn it upside down and put it in. Oh, no. Nope, somebody might not see you. And so they reach in, they take out a coin, and they're, oh, yes, look at me. And another coin, and popping it in, and just till that huge bag is empty, So everybody, it's not like they're not, blowing a trumpet, but almost. And here comes this poor widow with her 2 bites, and she just drops it in. And we're told in verse 44 that was all she had. That was all that she had. And that's when Jesus called his disciples over them. He's about to teach them. Now, I want you to know, and I think, and I have in the past, read a lot into this, the act of this widow here. And before I say another word, I want you to understand, I know she's being sacrificial. She gave everything she had. I mean, you can't be more sacrificial than that. I know that she was poor. The reason I know she was poor, Jesus said she's poor. And when you've only got 2 mites and that's all you have, that's the epitome of poverty. And I'm sure she's placing her faith and trust in God. She didn't have anything else. Because she put in all that she had. Now, and while proportionally, as Jesus said, she gave more than all the rest of them, that's true. Proportionally, she did. She gave all that she had. I think that people have taken this thing and taken this widow and said, there's a model for giving. There's a model. Just show of hands. How many of you went to the bank yesterday, emptied your account, and put it in this morning? Because if she's a model, and that's an example that you're to follow, then why didn't you? Now, I'll tell you the people that do that, the people that say that she's a model, they're just like the Sanhedrin. They want you to give everything, because where is it going? In their pockets. Okay? Which is why I started out. She's sacrificial, she's poor, she's faithful, she's trusting God. All of that is true. I don't think that's the reason Jesus pointed this out. So let me tell you the main point here, that at least in addition to what we saw about her. First of all, I want us to think about the context in which this happens. Context is everything when you're interpreting God's word. And what did he just talk about? He just talked about how corrupt the Jewish leadership was, and that it was a den of thieves. They're rotten to the core. They are devouring whose houses? Widows' houses. And what is this woman here? A widow. Isn't that coincidental? So here's a widow feeding the coffers of these covetous, wicked, selfish men and system. And what Jesus is going to say in the next chapter, which is part of the context as well, about the whole system in chapter 13 and verse 2, do you see all these great buildings? Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. So here is this poor woman, this poor widow who put in more than all of them. I think that Jesus is using her as a real life example of a victim of this whole system. Here's one whose living is being devoured by them. They're so corrupt that this poor widow has been convinced that she needs to do this in order for her salvation to be real. And again, I am not trying to take anything away from this woman's heart. Please understand that. At least what I can imagine is her heart and her faith and her trust. I'm just trying to harmonize why now we're talking about this widow after we've just talked about people devouring widows' houses. The Jews taught that by giving these alms, you can have salvation. You can redeem yourself by the more you give, the more you get. I've heard that before. But I think another main point that Jesus is making, and for the benefit of his disciples, is that not all the population is corrupt. Not everyone around us is corrupt, like the leadership that I've just talked about. In fact, listen, not even all the leadership is corrupt. There's some great men that are going to come out of this, like Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus and others who are going to rise to the top out of the horrendous injustice of what's going on with Jesus, and they're going to become his public followers. And so I think he's trying to give his disciples hope that there's still righteous, faithful, sacrificial people who love the Lord. There's a small, dedicated remnant that still believe in him. I think that's why he's brought out this widow in her actions. And with that, Jesus leaves the temple, chapter 13, verse 1. And, as I look over all of this, look from chapter 23 and 24 and 25 of Matthew and 12 and 13 here of Mark, I cannot imagine the sorrow that Jesus felt, the pity that Jesus felt, the righteous indignation that Jesus felt, the whole range of emotions that he's having, all at the same time here on this day. He certainly did take up our infirmities and carry our sorrows. He was a man of sorrows and griefs and acquainted with those things firsthand. And As I read through this, I got to get into the 13th chapter here. You got one disciple as they're walking out. It seems like he missed the whole point. Man, look at these buildings. I mean, what kind of a statement is that? So out of place. He calls Jesus' attention to the buildings. Let me go ahead and go through that, and we're going to study about Jesus' response. Listen, I need you to understand that there's still charlatans among us today. There's still people out there in religious garments of some sort or another that are seeking personal aggrandizement and personal enrichment. They're still stealing from the poor, from the widows, and from the orphans. Their judgment's coming too. I think it's very interesting that the Jews, especially the ones that have just left the leadership, viewed themselves as being in control, that they're in charge of everything that's going on. They're going to feel really vindicated when they see Jesus hanging up there on the cross. And sadly, in doing that, they're going to miss the whole picture. I think at this point in our study, it'd be good for us to remember what Jesus said about his own crucifixion. In John 12:32, he said, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." When you look at that as a defeat, I'm telling you, that's a magnet. I'm going to be drawing all men to myself when I do that. In fact, earlier in John, in chapter 8 and verse 28, so Jesus said, "When you've lifted up the Son of Man," that's a euphemism for the crucifixion, "then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own, but speak just what the Father has taught me." Listen, when you crucify me, you will know exactly who I am. Amen. And you will know exactly who sent me. And that's the final lesson Jesus taught in the temple before his death. And when Jesus left, and I just thought about that this week, when Jesus left the temple, that was the last time God was in that temple. Jesus provides for us a choice between two options. You can choose to follow the flawed and failed and false religions of man, or you can choose to follow Jesus. Jesus' invitation was, "Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." And he promises to take care of us. He promises not to overburden us. His yoke is easy, his burden is light. I asked Randy to lead this invitation song, which is, "I have decided to follow Jesus." And if you haven't made that decision, but you need to make that decision, and you want to make that decision today, based on your faith that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said, "When you put me on the cross, you'll know who I am. You'll know who sent me." And by his resurrection, Romans chapter 1 and verse 4, he was declared with power to be the Son of God. When you turn your life around and begin to follow Christ and quit following your own way or following others, and you're willing to confess your faith that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, if you'll be buried with him in baptism, he'll raise you up. You'll come out of that watery grave a new creature, sins washed away. But you have to decide to follow him. And if we can help you with that, please come forward while we stand and sing.
I have decided to follow Jesus.